Okay, I think we may now be live. Great. So hello and welcome to today's webinar, co-hosted by 9-Line and the Council for Strategic and Defence Research. This session is titled Green Theatre, Exploring Partnerships for Joint Climate Action and Energy Security. I'm David McSweeney, the founder of 9-Line, and I'm standing in for my colleague, Dr. Manali Kumar, who unfortunately cannot be with us today due to illness, but is most certainly here in spirit. Today's event is being streamed on Zoom, YouTube, and social media. And so we welcome questions which can be directly entered into the chat windows below or via social media via the hashtag IndoPAC4All. That's IndoPAC, INDOPAC, 4 is a number and all. So simply put, every country in the world must face up to the existential planetary crisis that is climate change. Studies following COP26 make it clear that even if all the current 2030 and net zero pledges are met as promised, global temperatures will still increase by at least 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Asia is the most disaster-affected region in the world, and as temperatures rise, climate change is going to be a threat multiplier in the Indo-Pacific. Large parts of South Asia, for example, are considered to be facing high to extreme climate vulnerability, and the World Bank estimates that there will be more than 143 million internally displaced persons in South Asia by 2050. Important cities like Mumbai, Jakarta, Bangkok, and Ho Chi Minh City are also facing existential threats. And of course, food and water security will also be negatively affected in the coming decades. So, to help us make sense of these critical issues, I'm delighted to welcome our brilliant panel of experts. Dr. Ambika Vishwanath is the founder director of the Kubernetes Initiative. She is a geopolitical analyst and water security specialist with many years of experience in the field of governance and foreign policy. She has led Track 2 diplomacy efforts and consulted with governments and international organizations across Europe, India, the Middle East, and North Africa, and was the first Indian to be invited as a member of the prestigious Munich Young Leaders Network. Widely published, she is part of the inaugural cohort of the China-India Visiting Scholars CIVS Fellowship at Ashoka University, and she's also a non-resident fellow with the Agora Institute in Germany. Also joining us, James Bowen is a policy fellow at the Perth US Asia Center. He currently works on the intersection of hydrogen sector development and regional cooperation, as well as European engagement with the Indo-Pacific. James was previously a visiting research fellow at Berlin's Mercator Institute for China Studies, and from 2015 to 2017, he worked at the International Peace Institute in New York, where he edited its flagship Global Observatory publication, while also contributing to a number of programs there. Also widely published, he has consulted for international political risk firms in Australia and previously worked as a speechwriter for the Commonwealth and Western Australian governments. And finally, and by no means least, we are joined by Dr. Arunabha Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh is a public policy professional, advisor, author, columnist, and institution builder. He is the founder CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Among Dr. Ghosh's many notable achievements, he has advised India's Prime Minister's office, several ministries, state governments, and international organizations. He was previously invited by the government of France to advise on the COP21 climate negotiations and has served on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Energy. Like our other panelists, he's also widely published. He's written for numerous outlets, including the Financial Express, the Nikkei Asian Review, and the Times of India. In addition to his documentary work, he can be regularly found on Al Jazeera, CNBC, CNN, and many, many others. So, with that said, I'm now going to invite our opening statements. And so I'd like to go to James Bowen. James, you have 10 minutes or so to share your thoughts.
Okay, thank you, David, for setting the scene so well there for that introduction. And thanks to CSDR and 9-Line for the opportunity to speak today. So I think you set out the general feeling around COP26 quite well there. That it's tempting to look at it as a failure from the singular perspective that its commitments don't amount to a trajectory aligned with the Paris goal of limiting global warming to below 2 degrees and ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the Indo-Pacific has a big focus on that. So international climate action is, of course, about universal responsibility. The actions of Indo-Pacific economies are very, very visible in this space. and the world's major centres of economic and energy demand growth, that's going to continue. So the only regional governments who have consistently raised global ambition on climate at this or past COP negotiations, I think, are small island developing states, principally in the Pacific. And data from the Climate Action Tracker website shows that the only one of the larger Indo-Pacific countries it assesses is Nepal. Nepal is the only one who's made almost sufficient progress on Paris goals. Japan is the only other one that's assessed as falling into even the insufficient category. And so the rest of the countries in the Indo-Pacific have made either highly insufficient or critically insufficient progress on meeting Paris goals. So that's obviously disappointing. But I think there are other things that we could note from COP26. I think one of the discursive trends surrounding negotiations was more of a challenge to that principle has guided Indo-Pacific climate change development up until now, including under the aegis of the Paris Agreement, and that's around the permission for major but still emerging economies to prolong their emissions intensity growth as they seek developmental parity with advanced counterparts. So I think the underlying respect for fairness that undergirds that principle hasn't changed, but rather in the past couple of years or more, we've seen a massive gain in the availability, the cost and reliability of renewable energy and associated technologies, including things like green hydrogen, which I've done a lot of work on, that can more effectively challenge that traditional linkage between fossil fuel strength and the fostering of economic development. And I think there's even an emerging consensus that capitalising on new opportunities in this space, that's whether through greening the domestic energy mix or targeting green exports and even the related diplomatic opportunities from that arise from that, can be a source of increased competitiveness rather than setting you backwards, either as companies or countries in that sense. So I think it's certainly become increasingly permissible to implore the world's largest emitter, China in particular, to set and meet more ambitious climate targets, including to potentially bring forth its net zero target to 2050 from 2060, and to make stronger commitments on coal reduction in particular. Now, China does admittedly continue to have deep pockets of inequality. It's also undoubtedly an economic superpower with the technological and resource abilities to more rapidly decarbonise an economy that counts for about 30% of global emissions. And I think that type of logic is going to increasingly apply also to India and also other countries in South and Southeast Asia, and many of you whom actually don't even have net zero targets for the foreseeable future. Now, I don't want to detract from the fact. That's not to say that we should absolve advanced economies of their ongoing responsibility to still be the earliest and the biggest movers on decarbonisation, and to assist emerging economies in continuing to make that transition, whether on financial, technical, or other fronts. So on that note, I think that Australia, my home country, actually had a particularly poor showing at COP26, and particularly as Australia aspires to have a larger regional leadership role in other areas. So Canberra brought an underdeveloped roadmap for meeting its new 2050 net zero target. It refused to update its 2030 target or to sign on to some of the major pledges that we saw at the conference around coal and methane. So on that same front of advanced economies assisting developing economies, it was disappointing to note in the context of COP26 the levels of funding that we're seeing from the developed to the developing world continue to fall short of the promised $100 billion per annum that we should be seeing by now to aid the climate transition. And particularly as that figure was always a significant undercount of what we actually need. So those are some of the admittedly large negatives that we saw from COP26. But at the same time, I think that the lead up to the conference and the note it ended on upheld the intent and the logic of the Paris Climate Agreement and the admittedly imperfect realm of international cooperation on climate. So we now have in place a net zero coalition which covers most of the world's emissions, and we've got a continuing mechanism for inviting improved commitments to come. And the US obviously also came back to the table and exerted a strong influence on some of the proceedings. And I think there were some important, albeit sometimes symbolic and perhaps watered down words in the final communique and the surrounding pledges around the reducing the use of coal, methane emissions, and fossil fuel subsidies. But there are also some potentially positive binding outcomes, including mechanisms like the First Movers Coalition of major industrial customers who've agreed to large purchase agreements to accelerate the commercialisation of new technologies at scale. There's some similarly interesting announcements from the likes of the Asian Development Bank and Bloomberg Philanthropies to provide emerging economies with meaningful assistance on retiring coal assets and moving more quickly to adopt green energy. So those types of outcomes support that changing calculus I mentioned earlier about there now being viable pathways to achieve desirable levels of economic development at the same time as decarbonisation, albeit with a continuing need for considerable external support. So the great hope is that we'll see an intensifying race to the top that can more quickly but still justly break down some of those power structures and barriers to change which fossil fuel interests have built up over more than a century. As I mentioned earlier, it seems increasingly clear that both companies and countries that move quickly and strongly in the green space can increase their competitiveness. And so those actors could simultaneously avoid costs, including the accumulation of stranded assets, exposure to future penalties such as carbon pricing and associated trade barriers. So these sorts of incentives also support what I see as a big trend in the context of COP26, but also the broader context of climate action of the past few years. And that's an increasing synchronization of climate change action with the pursuit of broader geopolitical alliances and rivalries. So that's obviously symptomatic of a more contested Indo-Pacific regional and global order. But it could, in coming years, offer a more results-driven complement to the universal, but essentially voluntary and typically slow-moving UNFCCC-led process. So a coordination of US climate action with its broader foreign policy was the express purpose of Washington appointing John Kerry as its special presidential envoy on climate. And one of Kerry's noted outcomes at COP26 was securing an agreement with China for bilateral cooperation on raising climate ambition. But there are also elsewhere really strong and perhaps more concrete signs of the US essentially looking to utilise elements of its broader opposition to China or its broader rivalry with China in service of advancing climate gains. So a notable development there was the agreement between the US and the European Union to walk towards a framework for lowering trade barriers to their steel and aluminium production and the trade between those two blocs. And that's to the intended detriment of less climate-friendly product entering their market, largely from China. So progress on that front, I think, is going to be really interesting to watch, particularly if it involves the greater participation of other Indo-Pacific parties, such as Japan. So there was also evidence that the pressure that the US placed on Australia as one of its staunchest allies in the Indo-Pacific ahead of COP26 actually paid off in the form of Canberra raising its ambition. So the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison explicitly cited the need to protect the US security alliance as one of the central motivators for his country, for Australia, for eventually adopting a net zero by 2050 target ahead of COP26. And that was basically in the context of Australia, the US and the UK having formed the AUKUS Security and Military Technology Pact just in the immediate run-up to that. So I think that this, what I see as this emerging climate geopolitical nexus could aid in that much needed transfer of capital from developed to developing countries, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. So the European Union indeed has already signalled that increased financial assistance on renewable energy and green hydrogen development will be a key plank of its new global gateway response to the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. And that followed China itself also announcing that it would no longer be financing coal-fired power aboard through the BRI. So it too will be looking for increased green outreach to take the place of those fossil fuel assets. So I think that regional infrastructure commitments from other countries and coalitions could advance these trends, and the Quad of India, Japan, Australia, and the US is probably the best configured grouping for doing that, and it's already signalled its intentions in the climate cooperation space. So all four countries of that grouping have already made, or at least pledged, significant commitments to meeting regional infrastructure and other developmental needs, both individually and in the collective context of the Quad. And that's also often been followed by these countries making necessary changes to their institutional and their philosophical approach to market intervention. And that's a process that will be key to responding to the climate challenge when we see that the market has failed in a lot of ways to actually deal with the climate crisis thus far. So I want to stress, having made this argument, that international competition on responding to climate isn't the ideal solution. We'd ideally see cooperation through the UNFCCC or other processes being the main avenue of progress. But I think competition may have increasing appeal as a means of shaping other states' responses to the climate crisis in ways that have thus far eluded policymakers. And I want to just end on a couple of important caveats that I need to note in the context of this process. So the first is that we can't really be certain that the US will continue to play the anchoring role for any Indo-Pacific mechanisms should it experience another, a rapid about-face in its leadership at the next election, which is only a few years away. And the second major caveat that I want to note is that there's a pronounced need to manage some of the risks of geopolitical competition, interrupting or even severing some of the complex international value chains that exist around green energy and green technologies and have been critical to fostering some of the major progress we've already seen on the energy and the climate transition. So we can't ignore, for example, the role that China's played in building out and bringing down the cost of technologies such as solar, photovoltaic plants and panels, and also wind turbines, even if those processes were, at the end of the day, highly dependent on industrial practices that other countries oppose. So on the potential US change of government front, I don't think there's any other answer to that than for countries other than the US to take on more responsibility for leadership around climate and in that geopolitical context that I mentioned earlier. So I mean, that did happen in the Trump administration in other areas, including security. So I think that climate could be advanced still, even in the absence of the Biden administration or a similarly aligned US administration. Now, finally, on the uncoupling front, I think what ideally we need to see is a highly selective process that seeks to preserve the beneficial economic interactions that have advanced the green energy transition and the broader fight against climate. While simultaneously, countries might look to onshore components of clean energy value chains where it's viable, where it's economically and politically viable. And the great benefit there as well would also have significant domestic appeal in terms of boosting employment and boosting local development opportunities.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. That was a really fascinating overview. Thank you very much. Quite a lot to digest there, and I'm sure, like the other panelists, I'm sitting here thinking about all the points that you've raised. So thank you very much for a really wide-ranging statement. I'm going to go to Dr. Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh, if you could provide us with your introductory remarks. You have about 10 minutes or so. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and many thanks to CSDR and 9-Line for inviting me for this conversation. Following on from what James has just said, firstly, I agree with a lot of what has been said. So there's not that much to add. So just trying to think what's the different take I can give you. So the first point I wanted to highlight is for us to recognize why the COP process is important and also to recognize why it is not important. And so that we have some sense of perspective and neither overplay nor underplay the role that the COP negotiations have in the broader climate space. So the importance of it is, of course, that it is the multilateral platform, and regardless of country, big or small, landlocked or small island, rich or poor, that you have a place where you can articulate your views, your positions, regardless of whether you're finding a zone of possible agreement with your interlocutors on the other side. It is also a place where, at least collectively, we can at least outline what our collective goal is. On both those counts, the COP process has, of course, evolved over time. And I think the Paris Agreement, by overturning the sort of top-down architecture, allowed for many different voices to be not just heard, but to be able to articulate a very different kind of climate action, depending on what each country thought was possible. Now, of course, all of that is contingent on one word, trust, right? And the trust only works when you deliver on your commitments. So and that's where the COP process and the FCCC process more generally has failed to hold countries accountable. And that's where then you end up in a situation where this is the platform where you announce what you're going to do, but this is not the platform where you are held to account for what you've done. Now, if this were a country, that's the distinction between, say, the parliament and the judiciary. But we don't have a judiciary. This is not even the World Trade Organization where you have a dispute settlement mechanism. So increasingly, we are going to face a problem from a sort of global governance point of view, a problem that we have somewhat managed to duck so far because it wasn't critical enough and it was just a subset of countries. But now we're talking about a universal set of actors without any real kind of enforcement and accountability mechanism. The trade regime has its own, the finance regime has its own sort of very differently structured accountability mechanisms, but the climate regime has none. Now, if you don't have accountability mechanisms, then you are in a situation where you're asking where else and how else can I establish that accountability? And I'm going to just park that thought for a second and come back to it in a few minutes. The bit about COP that did work this year and increasingly has worked over the past few years is, and James also referred to it, are all the announcements that happen outside of the negotiations but during the COP, right? So whether it's the First Mover Coalition announced this time, or whether it was the International Solar Alliance that was announced in 2015, in which I was intimately involved, whether it's the methane pledge, whether it's the deforestation target, all of this is basically using the COP platform rather than the COP process to sort of garner attention. So COP is serving as a lightning rod around which the right actors are coming together to make those announcements. I think that itself is an important service that the COP process provides. But again, the action and the accountability associated with it will happen somewhere else. There's a third part of it, which is that are there operational elements that are necessary for us to do whatever we want to do as a country or as a coalition of countries at a climate club? And are those operational elements coming from the COP process? One such operational element is finance, another is technology. A third, I would argue, is sort of insurance against severe climate shocks. Now, on all of these, the COP process is actually failing terribly. And I don't mean this in the sort of old school way of you created the problem, now you please pay me. The problem is if you don't seriously think about climate finance and the sort of catalytic role it could play to actually trigger real private finance and private investment, then it's of no use. So it's not about whether you got 100 billion or you got a trillion. It is a what purpose it was put to. And in the absence of money, the secondary conversation of what purpose itself is not happening. The technology platforms also are highly sort of disjointed from how actually technology gets developed, disseminated, deployed, and that's why you keep having talk shops and workshops around technology cooperation, but the real technology development doesn't happen there. Similarly with insurance, the loss and damage story has been going on for 14 years now, since 2007, and all we got is a new Glasgow dialogue. But the pandemic should tell us that global shocks are coming and they're going to come more frequently, and we don't have an insurance cushion against global shocks. Now, on all these three fundamental sort of operational building blocks, if the COP process is not delivering something, then we have this problem. So hence, in my last few minutes, what I wanted to focus on is what can we then leverage from what the 2 weeks of COP delivers versus what the 50 weeks of the rest of the year can deliver, right? So the first part was accountability. We have to now think about accountability through many other routes. The courts will be one, and increasingly we can expect a lot of climate litigation. We are already seeing that in Europe and North America, but I think increasingly the Indo-Pacific will be where some of that will begin to play out. Not just because some of the largest, most dynamic economies are situated there, but also that's where some of the worst impacts are going to be felt. And not just by small island states. It'll be felt by large states with small islands. It'll be felt by large states with long coastlines. And I think we are going to see a fair amount of climate-related litigation, and this is sort of the arena where this is going to play out. How it will impact, sort of regiopolitics? I don't know. Maybe we can discuss. The another way in which accountability is likely going to come is going to be through investments and what shareholders and sort of activist investors want. Now, again, why is the Indo-Pacific important? Because that's where investments have to flow. Whether it's for black or brown or gray or green infra, the infra is going to be built in the Indo-Pacific. We know that. Now, what kind of conditionality are the investors and the shareholders demanding for trillions of dollars of capital to flow into this region is going to be one more way in which accountability will unfold. And the third dimension of this, or a third route, is going to be, of course, citizens. Now, here again, we will have a challenge because the Indo-Pacific is in part democratic, in part semi-democratic, in part not democratic at all. So how will citizens' voices get articulated to establish not just climate action accountability, but what that means for sort of general evolution of domestic politics in very large, very dynamically evolving economies and polities is a question for us. Similarly, with those building blocks, the technology development, the financial innovation, and the insurance cushions will also have to come from sort of parallel architectures. James talked about green hydrogen, for instance, right? Absolutely. The bulk of the demand will come from Indo-Pacific. Where is the R&D happening? It's happening in Northern Europe and a little bit in North America and a little bit in East Asia, in Japan. But your market is all going to be the Indo-Pacific. So what kind of rules, standards, etc., will be set to create a global green hydrogen market that is secure and provides the energy security for the industrial fuel of the future? What kind of financial de-risking mechanisms will drive down the cost of capital for huge amounts of investments that have to flow into this area? What kind of innovative insurance system mechanisms will be created to pay out when climate shocks hit? Which then leaves me with that third bit, that the COP process allows you to have these other announcements made on the sidelines. The question I pose before all of us is, how long will these announcements keep going on at sort of COPs and action elsewhere? Or will eventually, the climate clubs for various things, whether it's on forestry or on methane or on hydrogen, start finding new forums and new governance architectures where not only the announcement happens, but the action also happens and the accountability also happens? And I see that there is a need for the countries of the Indo-Pacific to start thinking about these parallel architectures proactively rather than reactively. We've seen how the trade regime has somewhat unraveled because now we have these parallel mega trade blocks emerging also around the Indo-Pacific. Some favored by one set of countries, some favored by another set of countries. If we let that happen to climate and climate action, we are in for a very suboptimal world. A suboptimal world on trade and investment, a suboptimal world on climate action, and a suboptimal world, of course, of regional security. So let us not overplay COPs any more than what they do, and they can do it for 2 weeks a year. But let's start thinking about actively the architectures for announcing cooperation, the architectures for enabling action, and the architectures for ensuring accountability.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ghosh. There was quite a lot to digest there, really interesting thoughts. And I've just made a note here. I've written the 4 A's: action, announcement, accountability, and architecture. And we'll perhaps come back to some of those in a bit. And I'm also really interested, you mentioned litigation, and I think that's going to be a very interesting area to discuss in terms of the geopolitics of all of this. So we'll maybe come back to some of that later on. Now, finally, and by no means least, I'm going to go to Ambika for her opening remarks. Ambika, thank you.
Thank you, David. Can you hear? It's good? Yeah. Okay. thank you also to CSDR and 9-Dash for having me here at this discussion and conversation. I have to confess, when I first got the invitation and saw who the other panel members were, I was like, I told Manali also, I said, I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to be adding to this discussion, given that you have James and Arnaba here in this conversation. And I've just met James, but I know Arnaba from before, and he knows I'm not an energy person in that sense. But what I do want to talk about, and I think this is why I'm going to presume a little bit why Manali and you, David, invited me to this discussion, is an important dimension of the energy climate nexus that doesn't get discussed, I think, enough, and that is water. And I want to add that dimension as to pick up also, because I think both James and Arnaba mentioned important points that I feel like maybe bringing water into this whole discussion might be a way to then think about solutions going forward to solve some of the crises that they both mentioned. Now, I'm not going to at all touch upon whether the country's commitments were enough or not. I don't think that making more commitments on paper is necessarily going to translate into any form of action. There's a lot of issues over there with finance, with technology, and various areas. What I do feel is that if we think a little bit more creatively on some of the problems that are being put forth, and then I guess bring the water angle into it, it might help solve some of the problems that we are likely to face going forward. In that, I'm going to pick up on what James talked about, caveats. And he mentioned two very important caveats. I'm going to add a third one over there and link that a little bit to what Arnaba said on trust. And he said about insurance against climate shocks. And I feel like bringing this water element into the energy and climate discussion then is your third caveat as to what we can do going forward. It's not the biggest area when it comes to trust building, but it could be one of the areas of trust building between nations, especially countries that share water resources. And we're talking exclusively about the Indo-Pacific, and there are several groups of countries here that share water resources. And I'll bring that, I'll link that into the climate and the energy discussion in a minute or so. But I think trust is important then in both aspects. And looking at how long-term water security from this lens of energy and climate, or looking at your climate and disaster from a water lens, is a way to look, is a different way of considering an insurance against climate shocks in the future. And so I'm really glad that both of them said these specific words and phrases, because it's making my job in that sense much easier. Now, for those who might be wondering why I'm talking about water in this space, I want to say very clearly that it's not new when we talk about water, energy, and the carbon nexus. A lot of research has happened in this space. CEEW in that sense is a leading think tank in India that does work on this space, and a lot of other organizations, think tanks, universities around the world. But that academic research has not really come into the mainstream policymaking discussion. And that is where I feel like is where we failed a little bit. So when we talk about water, energy, and climate, or I don't want to say carbon, because it's bigger than that, right? When we talk about that, what does that mean in simpler terms? Let me talk about desalination here in that sense, right? Because we are saying Indo-Pacific and the coastline and island states. Now, desalination as a means of securing your water availability for the future for a lot of countries, for a lot of regions, states within countries, India is one of them, is being considered as a very important part and parcel of that water security conversation going forward. I know it's a big conversation in India and in states like Maharashtra, especially when Bombay is where I live. And what is the problem there then? You're looking at increasing your water availability through a very energy intensive process. What does that mean then for your energy security going forward, right? Which is one way of looking at why this conversation needs to happen together in tandem. Let's look at it from the other side, and hydropower. Now, again, I mentioned India, but it's not just India. It's a lot of countries in South Asia that share water resources. But the use of hydropower is something that's being considered as a very important parcel of clean energy going forward. I'm not going to throw any numbers out there because I've been trying to unpack some of these numbers, and I confess I'm not really sure I'm understanding this right. But India is the has the fifth largest hydropower capacity in the world, and as I understand it from my energy friends and experts, this doesn't necessarily translate into absolute reality and what is possible in terms of generation and then use. But the question here and the important point here is that capacity, there are plans to exploit that capacity because India needs energy, as do other countries around the world that are developing. Now, when we look at solely at hydropower as a means to do that, one, it then leads to whole other forms of water issues that are not always considered. I'm not saying all hydropower projects are bad in that sense. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. But I'm saying if you don't consider the other cascading effects of it, yes, then they could be considered. They could come up with these issues. And the other side of it is when you consider hydropower energy and dam building in areas that are sensitive, like you're looking at the Hindu-Kush Himalayan region or other mountainous regions around the world. So then you have a whole host of other climate-related disasters that might come from these climate shocks that Arnava touched on, and we're talking about increasingly so. So looking at it both sides, right? Whether you're talking about water and the ways to increase and minimize your water security by then using energy intensive processes is not helping your goals and your emissions. And if you look at then energy from the other side, but you're not considering what it means for your water security and then climate related disasters and incidences, that's not helping your energy problems going forward either. So we're then coming back to a problem where we're saying, okay, this is our goal, this is our commitment, this is how much we have to reduce our emissions going forward. But you're going to then land up with an issue 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line with a whole host of other problems that you hadn't pre-planned for in advance. And so I come back then to that whole, the necessity of having this discussion broaden now. We've been talking about these commitments, of course, now more so than ever, just because COP26 is, the COP discussions are over. But I mean, that's a bubble discussion, right? There are people who have been talking about these issues for years and years and years and decades. And again, I point to the people on this panel here with me. I don't pretend to be one of them at all. But we need to, it's important now for these discussions, I think, to widen that base, so to speak, and so that we bring in new forms of thinking, and then hopefully some of that new forms of thinking will then aid not solving, but at least aiding in the process to solving some of these problems that we are discussing. I want to just end with an important point over here, because the question of finance is also very much on everybody's mind and on the table over here. And so the role of businesses, I think, is really quite necessary again in this discussion, not to say that it's not already present when we talk about energy and climate and carbon, but when this new triangle of water, energy, and climate, and I'll give you a simple. I was doing some research on this, and I've been looking at risk to businesses from the lack of water security. But I do understand now increasingly so is that that's a very narrow lens that I've been looking at, and I have to look at it as a risk to businesses from the lack of water and energy security, because they are very, very inextricably interlinked. And I've been doing some research, and I realized that there is very little data available on this matter already. So one, we need a lot more research on what this means, and two, how then businesses will understand better the risk to them. And so they can then play a role that's beneficial to them. I mean, let's not pretend that they are going to be doing this from an altruistic perspective, but then that's beneficial to the communities and then the regions and the countries going forward. And I have some data over here that I think was quite interesting. There's a report that talks about that the lack of clean fresh water threatens $425 billion of value across more than 500 companies around the world. Now, these are big numbers. I get that. But if we break that down a little bit, that loss to Asia is around 6% of Asia's GDP growth going forward for the next, this coming decade. Now, let's break that down a little bit further down to India. And based on some very rough calculations, I picked the automobile industry because there was a lot more data available on the automobile industry as opposed to some of the others. And the greater Chennai region in southern India is home to 40% of India's automobile industry production, and so earning in that sense. And that region is also hugely water stressed. It's also a region that has a lot of goals when it comes to increasing their renewable energy. So I want to just put that out there. I'm not quite sure what this triangle means yet, but I'm in the process of trying to understand this. But 40% of the country's automobile industry is potentially at risk if we don't bring this whole nexus again together. And so I wanted to just bring that down to India. It's simply because that's where I'm doing some of this research, and hopefully then wider in South Asia as well. So data is definitely suggesting that businesses have a role to play from both sides. And I think that's a way we can consider this. I'm going to stop here and just simply reiterate that it's important to widen this conversation to ensure that we don't come up with problems going forward. And I mean that from both sides. As a water person, I understand definitely the need for collaboration with the energy experts, with the climate experts, and I think vice versa, so that in trying to solve, the water stress, we don't then have energy stress and the other way around. So I hope I brought a different kind of lens to this discussion and not completely derailed it, David. And I'll stop here now so we have some time for questions and discussion.
Brilliant. And
Thank you.
And Bika, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and always to say that you always bring a wonderful lens. So thank you very much. And I guess I'll just made note of a couple of interesting points there. India, the fifth largest hydro capacity, which is a really interesting point. And I think maybe we can get back to that as well. But just in terms of looking at some questions, I guess one of the things I really want to try and do is just to take a moment, I really just mean a moment, to look back at COP26 and just to get your respective views. I mean, I think it would be remiss of us not to pause and just get your respective senses as to how you view that. It's been in the rearview mirror. It was obviously billed as the last great chance to save the planet, and heading into the event, expectations were low. So given the objections from China and India on coal to phase down rather than phase out, I'm wondering, it's a few weeks now in our rearview mirror. Where do you all come down on the event as a whole? So if I can go to James, please.
Thanks. So I think I mentioned, if you look at the central metric of where we are in terms of limiting the climate change based on the Paris Agreement, then you have to consider the process a failure. But as to go said, a lot of the developments that happen on the sidelines and COP being providing an opening for those sorts of developments that actually might have some tangible impact. There were some things like the First Movers Coalition and I said the sort of commitments to actually helping to phase out coal through financial support in developing countries. Those sorts of things could actually have some sort of impact. So I think that, I probably went into COP26 with fairly low expectations around getting some breakthrough agreement based on, past example. So in that respect, it wasn't like a massive disappointment in terms of what I was expecting to come out of it. And I think that the real work always happens after the conference, as we mentioned. There has to be, and that's the intent, as I said, of the Paris negotiations, of the Paris Climate Agreement, that countries will continually upgrade their ambition. So it's up to domestic polities in all those countries that went to the COP26 negotiations to keep the pressure on. So domestically, that needs to happen. And as I said, there's a lot of international mechanisms that might operate outside that formal UNFCCC process that will actually hold other countries to account as well. So from that perspective, a failure to reach its goals, but inevitable in some senses.
Okay, so some things perhaps predictable and others success in some other areas. So okay, James, thank you. And Bika, I'm going to come to you if it's okay, and then I'll come to Dr. Ghosh. And Bika, just your immediate thoughts just on COP26. Where did you land after the event?
David, I'm going to say I'm not sure if I had very high expectations, but I am going to defer to the experts that I was following and reading their analysis. And it seems that if it depends on whom you ask as to where the COP, the whole 2 weeks went. Some of people I know from India who went, I think would say that it went well. But some of my friends in the Western part of the world who were there, experts in this space, were very disappointed. I would say that if I look at it again from this water lens, it was probably a little bit disappointing, because I think that there were a few conversations on the surrounding areas where it took this whole concept of climate and what we can do going forward and placed it in all these other areas of when we talk about food security, water security, gender, and all of that. But those conversations were too few. And for somebody like me who sort of looks at that bigger picture sometimes, I think that was really disappointing in that sense. There was, and then as somebody who works on gender, I feel like there was I was very disappointed. And I'm not going to talk about, whether the people were there or not, but just the discussions itself, I think we needed to have a lot more of a gender dimension. I realize this doesn't answer your question very directly in about, are we happy with the outcome of COP at all? But I think those outcomes were not unexpected at all in some ways. And a lot of this was already understood from before by the experts who were there. So I want to sort of just mention some of these other areas that I feel like could have had a bigger play in these discussions.
Right. Okay, that's really interesting, and I guess that's a very important point to bear in mind. It's who you ask, and I think that's a key. That's obviously a key point. Dr. Ghosh, I'm going to go to you. Your takeaway again. It's in our rear view mirror. How do you land on the event several weeks down the road?
Well, in part, it's hard to have an objective view if one has been, too intimately involved. But I see it in two parts. One is it was plugged as what is called an ambition COP, and the other is it was plugged as a finance COP, right? And the idea was, ambitions of course have to rise in line with what the planet needs, but the expectation also was the finance needs to flow. From an ambition COP point of view, I think it actually did not do a bad job of delivering, and you have to recognize that 1 week before COP, we were on a trajectory for 2.7 degrees of warming. And after the announcements that India made, which I think are the most transformational statements that India has made on climate in 3 decades since the UNFCCC was negotiated, of course, in a best case scenario, we are looking at 1.8 degrees. Now, 1.8 degrees is not 1.5 degrees, but it's also not 2.7 degrees. So we have to recognize that. That's why I said, COP serves as a platform to make these announcements. That's only as good as the resources available to deliver on those announcements. and then the accountability that comes with it. Now, we've already established that FCCC is not where accountability will come. But on the finance corp side, and I think this is where we've kind of locked ourselves into this, I've called it the negotiated maximum and delivered minimum trap of $100 billion. And it's silly to keep talking about $100 billion when actually trillions, tens of trillions are needed. And it actually serves both parties on both ends. It serves the people who need the money to keep harping on a number that they've not received. And it very easily also serves those who need to pay up. Because while you get some flack for 100 billion not being delivered, you are still avoiding the harder conversation of the many more trillions that need to flow to a very different part of the world. So it's a cop out. And I think that's where, unfortunately, I would have expected that the UK, being a financial capital or one of the financial capitals of the world, would have done a better job on the finance part. And I don't mean it as, just the grants and aid that are, the overseas development assistance. A real hard, literate, financially literate conversation around investments and de-risking of investments and increasing the flow of capital to where the infrastructure will be built. That's what was missing. And the third part, which is not related to the COP process, but as I said earlier, a lot of these parallel things got announced on methane, on forestry, and things like that. The industrial deep decarbonization initiative that India and the UK kicked off. Lots of such things that give one hope that the countries know where they need to go. So it's almost like the negotiated text is holding you back from what you already know what you need to do. So then you have to ask yourself, is the text going to follow the action, or the action is going to follow the text? And this keeps bringing us back to why this is a badly designed regime, to be honest.
Great. Thank you very much. That was really, really insightful. And I think that's a really important point when we talk about the numbers. People focus on the billions when actually it's the trillions that is clearly the harder conversation. So I think it's a very good point and very well made. So I guess I'm just going to pick up one pivotal point, that you made there, which is you talked about the UK, and I think it may well be interesting now to move to a type of conversation that looks at the geopolitics here, because I think that's something that was part of each of your each of your opening remarks. So I'm very keen to get your sense, with the increasing major power rivalry in the region, what role can multilateral institutions play in facilitating energy security and tackling climate change? So I think it's a key question. And I'm very keen to push you to name names here. Don't be shy, I would say, to our panel. So I just wonder who would like to go first. I'm going to put it out to the group before I call on any one individual. So would any of you like to step in and speak to that point?
I'll take a stab at this, if it's all right. Let's take a concrete example. We've got, let's take solar, and then let's take green hydrogen. Today, India has about 40,000 megawatts of solar, out of about 101,000 megawatts of renewables. Our calculations at CW show that for net zero by 2070, we need 5,600 gigawatts of solar. Right? That's 5.6 million megawatts. We're not going to be able to get there, apart from many other things of the materials, money, manpower challenge, by importing 90% of those 5,600 gigawatts of solar panels from 1 or 2 countries. So you need a very different approach towards energy security, where you need resilient supply chains and diversification of supply. Now let's talk about green hydrogen, which is going to be even more critical in my opinion. Not because it will have the largest share of the energy pie, but it will be in the part of the economy where there are few other substitutes. And that's what makes it critical. It's not, why is oil critical? Because you can't run cars in any other way unless you have a new battery operated vehicle, right? So coal drove the 19th century, oil drove the 20th century, green hydrogen will have to drive the industrial as the industrial fuel of the 21st century. Now, as I was saying earlier, you got bulk of the R&D happening in Europe. Bulk of demand will come from China. You asked me to name names. Bulk of demand will come from China. Bulk of the rest of the demand will come from rest of Asia. And what do we have today in terms of bilateral partnerships? I've examined 32 countries plus the European Union that are doing something on hydrogen. Only 7 are in Asia. 2 of them are oil and gas producers. So they're not in green hydrogen, they're into gray or blue hydrogen. 2 are in Northeast Asia, Japan and Korea. So they are advanced economies. So you're left with 3 Asian countries out of dozens where the hydrogen program hasn't even started, right? But that's where the demand will come. Now, we don't have a governance architecture today that ensures that there is security of supply of this critical industrial fuel of the 21st century. And what do I mean by governance architecture? Where will the minerals come from? Where will the electrolyzers get manufactured? Where will it be stored? How will it be transported? How will it be used? Who will finance? Right? The IEA was set up not to dig up oil and gas. It was set up to create a governance architecture for, at that time, the biggest consumers of oil and gas, because they did not have security of supply. We will need some architecture that is centered around the Indo-Pacific, but it is globally inclusive in nature, that provides that security supply of green hydrogen for energy security and for climate action, which is why I have of late proposed a global green hydrogen alliance to create those standards and rules, and again, in a proactive way, create the architecture that is currently missing. So just 2 examples, one of existing technology, solar panels. You can't get to the scale of action if market concentration is so heavily skewed. And you can't get to the new fuels of the future if you don't have the rules to determine security of supply.
Great. Thank you very much. I guess looking back, hydrogen there, I mean, James, this is clearly an area you know a great deal about. And I was keen to kind of pick up the forays I mentioned earlier, Dr. Ghosh mentioned earlier on. I'm keen to kind of just pick up some of those points. So James, you were sitting in Australia, you're looking up at Asia and countries, I guess, to the north of you. What does that architecture look like? I'm thinking about for those countries that Dr. Ghosh has talked about and indicated, how does that work? So can you talk us through how that will begin to play out over the next couple of years, and where the pitfalls might be?
Yeah, well, I completely agree that the existing infrastructure of the existing institutional infrastructure is inadequate to advance green hydrogen or any measure of renewable technology development, particularly to build up those value chains. Particularly, if you look at the role of China, for example, which has a massive concentration of the value chain in solar and wind, and also in the minerals that go into those things around critical minerals and rare earths. That's a sort of market concentration is going to be a huge detriment to actually building out these value chains elsewhere in the world. So my hopes for multilateralism in this space are quite limited at the moment. I think that minilateralism is kind of the emerging trend around these sorts of developments. And as I mentioned, the Quad, in the context of energy cooperation, green hydrogen can be something that the Quad would look at as well. And I think that individual bilateral relationships are going to be really important as well. So from the Australian perspective, we are very concentrated, very focused on building up the Japan-Australia relationship in the hydrogen space. So Japan is emerging as the big foundational demand side driver on hydrogen in the Indo-Pacific. Interestingly enough, it's not kind of looking so far at green hydrogen, it's looking at other pathways to get there. But Australia has a natural complementarity with Japan as we're looking to be the export superpower. So, and if you look at past examples as well, we've already done this. Japan and Australia have already done this in the LNG space. So Japan was the foundational LNG demand side driver in the Indo-Pacific as well, and Australia and Japan forged a relationship there that benefited other countries in the sense that Korea, Taiwan, China also became major buyers of LNG. Other producers entered the market as well after the Japan-Australia relationship was established. So I think that it's going to be built from the ground up, basically. Those foundational business-to-business and country-to-country relationships will have to start somewhere. International cooperation is absolutely fundamental to getting those put in place, and it's lacking at the moment. But I think the institutional architecture around that will have to be developed in tandem with that, because the existing institutions such as the IEA don't have the membership, they don't have the they don't have the same standards that can apply to every country in the Indo-Pacific. The policy settings, the market orientation of the Indo-Pacific countries are not well suited to the existing infrastructure.
Thanks, James. And I guess I'm sitting listening to you there, and you've mentioned AUKUS, you've mentioned Australia, you've mentioned Japan, of course. I'm thinking the elephant in the room here is China. And I'm wondering how China then, in your view, fits into that arrangement. Where do you see China fitting into all of this? Because as Dr. Ghosh mentioned earlier on, China, of course, will be a huge consumer in all of this. So I'm curious to hear your view.
Yes, I mean, I think the interesting trend as well in Chinese energy market development is around self-sufficiency and autarky to some extent. So in the green hydrogen space in particular, we won't necessarily see the development of regional interrelationships we did in previous energy markets, because China obviously has a massive renewable capacity at the moment, in a lot of places excess renewable capacity that might be channeled into green hydrogen. And it has a very strong focus on actually avoiding or exacerbating existing import dependencies in fossil fuels and transferring those over to the new green economy. And it also, obviously, as I said, has control over a lot of the value chains already and the critical mineral imports into a lot of the infrastructure that needs to be developed. I think that there's going to be a very strong extension of what we saw in hydrogen, what we previously saw in the solar space, for example, around photovoltaic manufacturing with the European Union and Germany and the US, where there'll be a very strong competition about dominating those value chains as well. China has a pretty strong lead already in a lot of technologies in the green hydrogen space. So the geopolitics of this are going to be quite interesting. And I don't think that, a lot of people talk about the energy transition as ending the, complex fossil fuel geopolitics we had. I don't see that happening at all. I think it's going to carry over into a new world.
Really interesting. Thanks, James. I guess you've mentioned the European Union there, and I know, Ambika, you've done some work in Europe, and I know it's a part of the world that you're familiar with. So I guess I'm just wondering if you pivot the discussion to that just for a moment. I'm wondering what role extra-regional powers, especially the EU, can play in supporting the Indo-Pacific's energy and climate assistance need. I'm wondering what about your view on that?
Thank you, David. I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer this question. I mean, I've worked with the European Union and various other partners on other spaces, but not on energy. So I'm going to yield my time to the other two. But if I can actually ask a question also, or make a statement in the form of a question, which maybe
sure.
Arnab and James might want to answer or comment on. Green hydrogen, as I understand, is also water intensive, unlike solar and wind energy. And I do realize that there is that trade-off that we need to make as people going forward, as to, it's not always going to be rosy on both sides. So in this new architecture that Arnab is suggesting, which I think is important not only for this space, but hopefully this new architecture will aid in many other areas of global governance that we really need to rethink. Is it possible to ensure that this alliance and the way of thinking under this new architecture brings in that safeguard going forward in some format, so we don't, like I said before, run a risk of having new problems while we're solving certain ones in today. And I don't know the answer to that at all, but it's maybe something to think about if when we're thinking about what kind of energy we want going forward. And in that sense, maybe some of the European Union or few countries over there, maybe some of their experience on certain areas of cooperation that they have found created positive frameworks of might be useful to study. I don't know, again, if that's the way to do it, but I'm always of that opinion that there are positive areas of cooperation when we talk about water, when we talk about like food security, for example, from many parts of the world. And some of these frameworks have lasted for years and years and years. They have very strong legal architectures attached to them. And we don't always need to reinvent the wheel. We can, in fact, borrow from some of these spaces. So again, it's kind of a question, maybe it's a suggestion also in some of your work going forward to look at some of these other spaces that we might be able to consider going forward. So David, I'm sorry, I realize I didn't answer your question at all, but maybe it opens up that discussion to the other two.
It does. I'm very happy to, and I think it's an interesting point. And I guess I'm looking at James and I'm looking at Dr. Ghosh. I'm wondering if either of you'd like to come in on that.
Well, I think Ambika is making a very important point, and let me respond to her first point about the water requirement in green hydrogen through a different analogy associated with, say, critical minerals, right, or rare earths. Rare earths are not rare. Rare earths are actually found all over the world. Rare earths are rare because they are the concentrations in which they are available within the rock formations is small. And that's why the extraction of rare earths is a very environmentally and energy intensive exercise. And there are only a few countries that choose to, take on those environmental costs and thereby get access to that market concentration. Now, let's think of a counterfactual. Suppose we had a global architecture or a minilateral architecture of the largest economies that offered security of supply of critical minerals. Then we would be extracting rare earths in more environmentally sustainable ways, in different geographies, in ways that adhere to certain standards, etc., where this temptation that I need to produce it all is mitigated because you will get it, and you'll get it when you need it at the price at which you need it, the definition of energy security, if you have that architecture. Right? That architecture is missing, hence we have a very distorted global rare earths market. The same will happen with green hydrogen. If you had security of supply, if you had clarity of rules, if you did not have trade barriers, then despite that water requirement, you would perhaps produce the hydrogen in a relatively water abundant place, but you might manufacture the electrolyzer in a different place. You might extract the minerals for the membrane from a third place. You might have the storage facilities in a fourth place. Instead, if you have to do what James was narrating as kind of the thinking that China has or many other countries might develop, then you're locking yourself into a very suboptimal design, right? Where even if you're water constrained, you're going to use all the sunshine you have to draw up all the water you could use. So this is exactly why we need to design new governance architectures for the low carbon energy security of the future, because the general problems of energy security are not going away. You're just substituting one solution for another. And on the EU side, I think apart from what Ambika said, and the EU has many examples of transboundary water cooperation, I think one other area, and it's increasingly encouraging that the EU is paying attention to the Indo-Pacific as a strategic sort of geography rather than just an afterthought, is how do you cooperatively deal with risks, including water risks. So, what kind of resilience do you build in? What kind of administrative capacity is needed, etc. I think there are a large number of EU countries that would have an interest in the region, and from which we can, with whom we can cooperate and learn.
Thank you. And I just want to come in on that point, because I think it's for people watching this, we're talking about the EU, and I just wonder, Dr. Ghosh, you may or may not be in a position to answer this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. When you say Europe, or are you referring to individual member states, or are you talking about the European Union as a whole? Because I'm thinking about the European Union and how Europe engages with the region. I know certain countries are doing things by themselves and are going down that road. And of course, the European Union, as it often does, can be fragmented around lots of different things and unifying around others. So I'm just curious to kind of push you a little bit on that and hear your thoughts.
Sure. I mean, to the extent I can answer, I think there are certainly, it's not EU driven, but certainly members, different countries in Europe have found ways to cooperate on water through, long-lasting agreements on transboundary water, whether it's for the Rhine, whether it's for the Danube. So that's what I was referring to. On development of new technologies, for instance, as I said, there are a lot of European countries, but there's also an EU program on green hydrogen. But let me take a slightly different position on this. Think of the origins of the EU or the origins of the European Economic Community. It started from the European coal and steel community. And what was the grand idea behind that? That unless you pool the resources, we'll end up in a third world war, because the countries of the region have gone to war over a critical resource. I mean, beyond the ideology, the political ideologies. At the end of the day, Jean Monnet's idea was you got to pool the resources of the Ruhr Valley, where iron ore and coal, etc., rest. And if we can do that, we create a community for steel and coal, which are the foundations of an industrial economy, which then serves as the bedrock on which various other kinds of EU cooperation has unfolded for the last 70 years. Can we think of what are those foundational technologies and resources that are needed for the low carbon future that we all need? And then think of what kind of pooling of resources, what kind of security of supply, etc., is needed. Hence, I keep coming back to green hydrogen as it's not going to, we will not have either a sustainable planet or a sustainable international politics without a governance architecture on green hydrogen. We will have to pool resources, and the EU's example is the historical lesson.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting point. I guess one of the things we're talking about here is leadership. And I know, James, you mentioned earlier on, you talked about raised Australian ambition via US pressure. And I guess I'm just thinking about the Indo-Pacific region now, and I'm wondering where the leadership is. I'm looking around the room. We have representatives, of course, from India and Australia, and I'm wondering in terms of where you're all sitting, what does leadership look like? Who is leading, and what does that look like from your respective positions? So, James, I wonder if I can come to you, because you originally made that point.
Well, I think my point was around US leadership and US leadership coming back into the climate space in the Biden era, and the threat that could rapidly evaporate with a change in government. So I think that's been one of the most market trends. And the US would like to consider itself an Indo-Pacific economy and Indo-Pacific power as well. So perhaps we could count that. I think it has to be who is actually walking the talk as well around decarbonisation as well. And as I said earlier, there's only a couple of countries that are actually anywhere near where they need to be. And I think Japan is actually making some pretty good strides on this. And Japan, as I said, is willing to form international partnerships around hydrogen, around other areas, and exhibit some leadership. It's actually set up a dialogue, a ministerial dialogue on hydrogen. We're seeing investments in a few different countries in the region, including in Brunei, in Australia, and in other places, and that's part of a broader infrastructure commitment as well. In terms of Japan has been outspending China in a lot of areas in infrastructure development and development funding in the region for a long time. So I think there is a nascent leadership from Japan on climate and responding to this threat. But it's not what needs to be there. I don't think I'm seeing anybody who's exhibiting the correct level of, or the appropriate level of leadership yet so far in the region. But that's one example I would point to.
Thanks, James. And Beacon, I'm going to come to you with that same question. I'm wondering about your view, or do you share James' view?
Can I go last, David, if that's all right?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to go to Dr. Ghosh then.
I agree with James that the leadership issue is, again, there's an overplay of it and an underplay of it. The overplay is whoever makes the, when we say the one who screams loudest is the one who's heard, right? So we've had a lot of screaming, and we've had a lot of announcements in the past and in the present, and we say, that's the climate leader. Look at their ambition, right? And that overplays the sense of who a climate leader is. The underplay is that we don't realize that climate leadership is actually very disaggregated. If Brazil does not lead on forestry, there's no climate leadership on forestry. Right? It does not matter what the US says on forests or India says on forests. Right? Equally, if China does not move on coal, it doesn't matter who else says what on coal. There's 4 billion tons of coal we consume there. Right? So climate leadership is not a crown that's worn by any one country. And the sooner we realize that, the sooner we will stop getting into these knots of, who has screamed the loudest and who has put forward the most aggressive target, and actually focus on the action. I had a investment banker visit me just a couple of hours ago, and we were discussing, again, in this region, what will be the actual investment that will flow based on whatever announcements have been put forward, right? Because ultimately money will only flow where the policy combined with the rules, combined with the market design, combined with the off-taker, combined with the developer, all have to be lined up, right? And that is all part of climate leadership. So I genuinely believe that we have and I guess I'm repeating what I said right at the outset of this program. We've overemphasized what is done at COP for 2 weeks, and we've underemphasized what is done for 50 other weeks in any given year. And let's start focusing on the 50 rather than the 2, and maybe you will find leaders that were standing in broad daylight and you never spotted them.
And I think that's a great point for people watching this, that COP, of course, draws all the attention in, but it's what's happening else around that and after that. And Vicky, you wanted to have the pleasure of the last word on this point.
Oh, it's not so much pleasure, but I wanted to hear them both. In that, I think what Arnaba says, I will add on to that is that also it's not only about national leadership. I think increasingly so it's important to find the leaders who are in cities. If you take a city like Mumbai or any large city that's going to be very heavily affected in going forward. You mentioned Bangkok and Jakarta. So what's the kind of leadership that we're seeing in cities? In a country like India or China or big countries like the US that have states, is there leadership at that level as well? I think it's important because not everything needs to happen at that high level national space. Sometimes really good leadership at the city level can help all cities going around the world that might be facing similar problems. And what is the kind of leadership we're seeing in the islands? What is the kind of leadership that we're seeing coming out of indigenous populations? Can we study something from them in that? I'm saying what's happened already for decades, say if we're looking at, smaller places in Brazil, the northeast of India, parts of Africa. And I mean, I don't even know enough at all to say what is happening in any of these smaller places, but I feel like that's something we need to study from and learn. So leadership in that sense, I think, comes from many different spaces, and all of them need to come together. It's not just that you cannot have one person or the office of X country doing that. And I'm gonna just add on a little bit here to say that the academic and research community and the ones who are doing the field work, I think we need to sort of take a lot from that community. I will say put them as one community because they are really giving us the tools to be able to then look at that bigger picture. So let's give them a bigger voice in that sense because that's really important.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. That's I think that's actually a great point to begin to bring this discussion to a close. I realize that we've actually just gone a little bit over time, so I'm going to say thank you very much to our panel. I'm going to, just before I do that, just going to ask for one very simple final concluding point. So I'm going to ask our panelists if they can just give us their very quick view as to what the next, what should we be looking at for the next 10 years? So the next decade ahead, what are the kind of key points in terms of energy and security as quickly as they can? If you can just let us know your thoughts. So what are the kind of key things that people should be keeping an eye on? So I'm going to go actually to Dr. Ghosh first.
At a national level, at least for India, there have to be two big pushes, one on industrial decarbonization and the other on sustainable agriculture. This is not to substitute for all the big things that need to happen for renewables, but these are the two areas that we've not done enough work on. And the work that happens in the next decade on both these areas, on industrial decarbonization and sustainable agriculture, will then define the real move towards net zero in the decades to come. At the international level, starting with COP27 in Africa, we have to start thinking about COPs as development COPs. And the more we align development strategy with climate action, the more we will get the political sustainability for sustainability.
Thank you very much. James Bowen, I'm going to go to you.
Well, I think the most obvious thing is to say we're beyond the point where we should start to expect to see emissions actually drop around the world, and I think that political leaders need to start taking some really big decisions. So if you look at my own country in Australia, shortly after COP, after going to COP26 with a net zero emissions strategy, they've still been approving coal mines, still been approving natural gas developments, LNG export projects. So, we need to actually see some tangible results in terms of what decisions governments are making, not just the demand side, but the supply side as well, I think.
Great, thank you. And Ambika, your final thoughts for the years ahead.
Is that there is no security on energy, resilience, climate, food, if you don't bring a water security angle to all of this. And also, I'm gonna be that person that says you need to bring a gender perspective as well to all of these conversations. And I'm completely going to steal Arnab's idea and say, these COP conversations are happening every now and then for 2 weeks. Maybe we need a whole lot of mini COPs or mini conversations that happen more at the regional level that can then actually be put into action going forward with this wider conversational lens.
Brilliant. I think that's a great point to take away. Two great points, should I say? I think the gender aspect is incredibly important, and certainly I think Dr. Ghosh's point about the keeping your eye on things that are around the edges and after COP, the other 50 weeks of the year, which I think is a really great point to take away. So thank you very much to our partners at the Council for Strategic Defence Research. I'm going to thank today's panel, Dr. Ambika Vishwanath, Dr. Arnab Ghosh, and James Bowen for sharing their valuable insights. I found it a fascinating discussion. I'm sure everybody watching this will as well. And I hope you will all join us for our next discussion on the Indo-Pacific in next year. So thank you very much.
Hi, and I'm Tisha, and on behalf of CSDR, I'd like to thank all the panelists who joined us today, as well as all the viewers who are listening in. And like David said, join us for future conversations as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.